right, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank NetRise, who you hear more from in a minute, and Carasoft, our distributor, and their studio for this podcast style event today. I think you guys will find it intriguing and conversational and learn a lot about the topics we're going to cover. So, cyber threats, everybody knows, are increasing every single day. And what's interesting is that we don't have insight into all the software, firmware, and embedded software we have. You know, everything we buy in the store by law has to have an ingredient bill of materials, so you stand there and look at what's in there. And for software and firmware, that really doesn't exist. So how do you know what your vulnerabilities are? How do you know the risk of those vulnerabilities? And more importantly, how do you mitigate them? So we're going to hear in a minute from NetRise to talk about that and some new innovation that's really solving that problem and a direct focus on that and how that fits into compliance, audit, and most importantly, how you protect your enterprise. So let me now introduce my guest, Thomas Pace, CEO of NetRise, one of Carasoft's partners, as well as Scoop Cyber. Prior to founding NetRise, Tom spent 16 years working security across multiple leadership roles, from Marine Corps, and thank you for your service, to being responsible for security within the Department of Energy, and also serving as Global Vice President of Cylance. So, invited Tom. He's a real expert in this field, and more importantly, a visionary of where it's going, and just delighted to have him with us. So before we get going, since NetRise is fairly new to the market and coming on strong, maybe just a little about NetRise, why it was launched, and what the real mission and purpose is.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me. So, to talk about where NetRise came from and why it was created, probably requires going back to a couple of different sets of experiences that I had. At Department of Energy, we had these issues where we would be getting reports or intel or whatever about particular vulnerabilities in particular software components, and basically being asked questions like, tell us which devices have these software components in them, or are you affected by this vulnerability, which would also require you to know if that component that has that vulnerability is present. And it just became very obvious that we really just didn't have a way to do that, especially as it related to firmware and embedded operating systems. And so it was just like a very surprising thing to me how difficult or really impossible to answer those questions were in a scalable, automated, effective way. So when I left there and went to Cylance, I helped build this professional services group that did a lot of this work. And it just became more and more obvious that other organizations had these same questions, and there just wasn't a good way to answer them. So, NetRise started off focused on firmware and embedded operating systems, reverse engineering them, extracting out key artifacts, generating SBOMs, all that. And then we significantly expanded our coverage to basically any compiled code. So whether that's a Windows application, a container, a mobile app, a standalone Linux binary, a virtual machine, a full disk image, a firmware image running on a plane, train, automobile, medical device, whatever, we can support all of that now. So essentially giving you full software transparency into your supply chain so you can understand what you actually have there. In the same way we care about having an asset inventory, the old trope, you can't protect what you can't see, or if you don't know it's there, which is incredibly obvious. The same goes for software. If you don't know what's in your software, it's impossible to know if you need to take some action on that or not. Just like your ingredients list analogy, which is obviously the most common analogy here. If you don't know what's in the food you're buying, you're not able to make an informed decision about whether or not you should buy it. If you have to choose between something that's organic and natural and something that has arsenic in it, you know, which one are you going to choose?
Yeah, and it's interesting. You go on Amazon, you order a new printer, it's made in China, and have no idea what it might be doing to your personal network at home.
It's true.
So we're going to do some just sort of functional areas to organize our discussion. So the first is going to be regulatory frameworks that are driving change. So maybe, Tom, an overview of the DoD Zero Trust overlays and why they're so critical to modern security. I mean, everybody's talking zero trust. So what do you think that really means? Not only to the DoD, civilian, state and local, but just enterprises in general.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a number of controls that that a software bill of materials or just in general software transparency, possessing that would check the box for there. And you know, a lot of the DoD Zero Trust, you know, security controls are derived from other frameworks, you know, NIST 853 or whatever. So how can you possibly ascertain the level of trust associated with something if you don't know what is in that something? You can't. That's not really a possible thing to do. So as it relates to the Zero Trust maturity model, a number of the controls that we help address here are related to just that. So if we know, you know, these software components are within this application or device or whatever, and we also know that those components are, maybe they're 20 years old. Maybe they're 20 years old and have never had a vulnerability reported for them. Okay. Maybe they're 5 years old and have had 100 vulnerabilities reported for them. Maybe they're end of life or end of support, but they've been used just over, you know, repeatedly because it still works. You know, so you have this big spectrum of what is in the art of the possible, and how you allocate trust associated with that is going to vary, you know, depending on what your risk appetite is and what these things are doing. So having the transparency into this software allows you to have data to support, you know, a particular decision or not. So those are some of the ways that, you know, this particular DoD overlay and why it's so important. You know, getting the visibility so you can feed that into like posture management and basically say, hey, I have this policy that is going to, as much data as you can feed into posture management is kind of the better, as long as it's well labeled and accurate and complete, obviously. So just like in the days of NAC, network access control, you could feed into a NAC, do you have antivirus? If yes, move forward. Is that antivirus fully updated? If yes, move forward. Did the antivirus find any viruses? If no, move forward, right? So the more data that you can feed into these posture management and trust platforms, the more confident you can be about trusting a particular system or application or network. So,
you know, if you were a system integrator, large enterprise, you're modernizing your infrastructure, would you recommend doing scans and using something like NetRise before they take delivery and put it into their enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, we're working with, you know, procurement and third-party risk teams for basically typically net new things coming in. The problem is there's no such thing as an organization that doesn't have any software, right? So there's always going to be this effort that takes what's already in place, what's already installed, and going and creating that inventory of what's already there. What we see a lot of our customers doing in the big enterprise or federal government space is saying, okay, listen, we're going to draw a line in the sand. And there's a number of ways you can draw that line in the sand. You can do it from a timing perspective and say, any software purchased on this date moving forward, or you can say any software that is going to run on these 2 or 3 networks, any software that is above this price, any software that has associations with these particular countries. Like, there's a number of ways you can draw those lines in the sand. Typically it's time-based, where at this point, moving forward, we're going to put all the software through NetRise, generate SBOMs, build that software inventory. But in parallel, you know, you also have to go back and do the same thing for all the software that's already been implemented. Think about it from a, I don't know, an antivirus perspective. You would never say, hey, we're only going to install antivirus on all of our new computers.
Right.
Right? You would never say that. You have to go install it on all of them, even the ones that are already there. So it's the same kind of thing. They're two separate problems, though. So, yeah.
So when customers say, I'm doing some of this now, why do I need NetRise? Where do you think the tools today fall short of?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways to think about two different kind of use cases. You have software producers, people building code, building first-party code. There, you do have other tools and capabilities that can help, but overwhelmingly, in the vast majority of circumstances, they are focused on source code. So they're looking at the source code that's being built, whereas NetRise is looking at the compiled code. So we only care about the thing that is finally built that you're either going to be putting in your environment or selling to other customers. We can look at things, in that pipeline from like the build phase onward, essentially, or pre-release builds and things like that too. That's fine. So in that space, in the software producer space, we sometimes, you see the traditional AppSec teams and all that. We're never telling anyone not to do source code analysis. Keep doing that. We're just saying there's a gap from a compiled code perspective in terms of looking at what's actually built at the end of the day. Now, from a software consumer perspective, so say it's, you're selling to the federal government, like, I don't know, the Department of Education. Does the Department of Education write software? I mean, maybe they write something, but overwhelmingly, they're a software consumer. The gap there is there's nothing. They have no way to generate a comprehensive software inventory from the ground up. And what I mean by that is oftentimes people confuse a software inventory for an application inventory. So just knowing that you have, this version of Zoom and Chrome and, Teams and Adobe Reader and all those things is great. But that is incredibly incomplete from a actual software inventory. That'd be like saying, hey, I know all the ingredients in my food. I have a cake and a casserole and a frozen pizza. That doesn't tell you anything about the ingredients that are in those three things. But that's the state right now is, you have vulnerability scanners and endpoint protection platforms that all do some software inventory, but it's not comprehensive. They're not giving you all the libraries, dependencies, open source components, packages, and then the vulnerabilities and potential exploits that are embedded in each of those components that make up those various pieces of, software or firmware. So there's just a massive gap there that is not really being addressed at all.
So how do you recommend, an organization finds a firmware vulnerability? Then what do they do? Do they go back to the manufacturer? Does NetRise help go back to the what's the loop that goes back, and how would you mitigate that?
Yeah, so obviously the context of that particular vulnerability matters, and based on that would depend on what you can or can't do. Let's say it's a vulnerability in a component that is, maybe it's not used. Maybe that's just an old component that the manufacturer left behind that is not actually in use. So, you can get that validation sometimes from the manufacturer themselves. We also provide visibility into things like, are these components running on that particular device? So, we pull in other artifacts that tell us what particular components, would very likely or certainly be running whenever those devices are on. Other use cases are if we know that the particular set of exploits associated with that vulnerability, you can integrate our data with other security technologies. So say you have a Palo Alto firewall with application-aware visibility, and the particular issue that's identified is a remote code execution vulnerability against some switch. We could basically feed that CVE from into a SOAR pipeline or whatever, and have that update a policy within like a Palo Alto firewall that automatically ensures that that is being monitored and blocked for that particular issue. Because now you know that issue is there. Whereas before, you might have like an overly broad policy for your Palo Alto firewall, and here you can become much more targeted. We do manage the communication between those OEMs for some of our customers, where we'll reach out to them and help validate or let those other people know that there are these issues. Getting them to actually fix them, or even getting the end users to fix them once they know there's a patch available is no easy task, right? I mean, you still have people getting compromised from like these Avanti and Fortinet vulnerabilities that have been out for a long time. So, but at least you have the visibility and you can make whatever decision it is you want to make on that. And whether that's, on the super aggressive end of the spectrum, you would, I don't know, replace that device manufacturer with a different one potentially. And on the less aggressive approach, you would, say, okay, FYI, maybe pump into your SIM and move on with your day. So wide spectrum of potential actions that could be taken depending on the finding.
Yeah, I mean, the more you talk about it and the more, I hear from NetRise, it seems like you need this if you're going to have a holistic security posture. I mean, there's a complete spectrum of that, and this is the slice that's been missing and that you really need.
Yeah. I mean, the way I think about it is nobody questions whether or not having an asset inventory is valuable. We have the critical security controls. There's, I think, 18 of them now. Used to be 20. Everybody can name the first critical security control, which is an asset inventory. Everybody knows that. And they're in priority order, by the way. So it's not an accident that asset inventory is number 1. Number 8 is malware defenses. Nobody can name number 2. Number 2 is a software inventory. I have talked to thousands of customers and prospects and companies just from starting NetRise. I have never met one customer or prospect that has a software inventory. I've never even had one that's pretended to have one. Even though it's the number 2 security control, everybody has malware defenses. You've never met a company that doesn't have antivirus or something.
Right.
And so that's really the way I approach thinking about it. When everybody's like, oh, what do I do with this? I try to reframe it for them in terms of an asset. I'm like, what do you do with your asset inventory? Do you go into work and log into your, let's use Armis as an example. Do you log into Armis and just admire it all day? Of course you don't. The reason you pay for one of these solutions is so when something happens, okay, this device was affected. Do I have more of those devices? If yes, where? Were those devices affected? You can now answer an entire new set of questions that you could not answer previously. The exact same thing is true here. I mean, we still cannot answer whether or not particular organizations or vendors are impacted by like Log4j. It's impossible. There's the biggest enterprises on planet Earth are incapable of determining if that particular library is built in to all of the software, firmware, embedded systems, mobile apps that they're using within their environment. It's not possible. They don't have a way to do it. So that's the big gap we're filling, and it's really just the exact same thing as an asset inventory. It's just from the inside out versus the outside in.
Everybody's talking about AI and AI this, and all the vendors are putting AI into their products, which really does add value. But what are your thoughts on the adversary having AI and how that might impact the ability to get into firmware where they could just do, literally pound away at it without having people? Do you think that's going to make it even more vulnerable on the firmware level because they know that's a spot that doesn't have these guardians?
Yeah, I mean, what I've talked to, I'll use an example. The federal government might be the best example for something like this. Whenever I'm talking to folks about this and they're having a hard time maybe perfectly understanding the value we can provide. Something that really hits home for them is me explaining that, listen, the only people who don't have this information is you. Like, we have the information. The vendor who built this thing has at least some of this information. And you know who definitely has it? The people that are trying to compromise you. Because getting your hands on, let's keep the firmware example of, some of these big, device manufacturers, whether they're making medical devices or routers or switches or security cameras or printers or any of these things is incredibly trivial. It's not hard to do. And so the idea that our adversaries, especially nation state adversaries, it would not have occurred to them to take a look at the top 3 biggest device manufacturers that are in every enterprise environment almost on planet Earth and rip those things apart and understand what software components are in them, and then potentially feed those things through some LLMs hooked up to MCP that's hooked up into Binary Ninja or IDA or whatever to reverse engineer those things and either find existing vulnerabilities in that code that have not been reported or find net new vulnerabilities in that code that they can exploit. Of course that's happening. Why would that not be happening? I mean, we're doing it for the purpose of finding the things to let everyone know about them to get them addressed, which means, we got a lot of smart people at NetRise, but you're competing against entire countries whose sole purpose, in those particular units at least, is to compromise, American infrastructure or American companies. So the only people that don't have the visibility is you, which I think is really the key thing to hone in on.
Yeah, I'll just give the audience an example that I saw. So I won't name the city, a large court system, and I didn't realize how large court systems are and all the systems that support there.
Huge.
But anyway, they found that their cameras that are in the courtroom were pinging back to China. I had no idea. So those are the kind of things that you may never know, right? So there's a lot of tools that'll see behind the firewall that's going on. Well, block traffic, but you don't realize how much firmware is around you, right? We're looking at recording systems, the television screen, any one of these could break in. So they don't have to go anywhere. They're in your house. They're in your enterprise. So to ignore that, really, it makes you in a vulnerable state. So, we talked a little bit about all this problem. How would NetRise, and I know you have a couple products, Turbine and Zero Lens, you're meeting with the supply chain lead for an enterprise, and they say, how could these products help me? How do I get these in my, what's the lift to get them in my environment? And a little bit, you mentioned earlier, how do they integrate with, SIMs and SOARs and other tools that are out there. But in particular, I'd be interested, and I think the audience, on those particular products.
Yeah, so Turbine, is our flagship platform that takes in any compiled code, rips it apart, generates a software bill of materials, enriches it with vulnerabilities, exploits. But we don't just, we're not just a SBOM company. We're also evaluating all of the software supply chain artifacts that exist within these particular assets. So credentials, whether those are associated credentials with users or hard-coded credentials that are not associated with users, public keys, private keys, certificates, this whole post-quantum thing has gotten to be a really big set of problems, which is great. It's just kind of interesting to me how usually cybersecurity solves a problem after it's been a problem for like 10 years. Look at SBOMs. Like, software's not new. Yeah. It's a perfect example actually of, it's not like getting visibility into the software that you build or buy is a game-breaking concept. There just really hasn't been a way to do it from a compiled code perspective because it's a much harder problem. And so we can give all the information related to public keys, private keys, and certificates, and whether or not they're post-quantum resistant and all that stuff. Misconfigurations, binary protections, and then it just depends what team we're working with. One of the interesting things about NetRise and our kind of go-to-market motion is the number of personas that we work with on a daily basis is pretty broad, and sometimes that can be intimidating for some folks. Like, I mean, almost on the NetRise side, like, well, and so we had to spend a lot of time prioritizing certain personas and ICPs and all that jazz, because say you're working with a third-party risk team, well, that's one of the better places to work, I think, because all the software is going to come through them, and so that's like a good channeling point. But you could also work with the vulnerability management team, or even the red teams, or if they have a product security team, that's a good place to start as well. And so then you need to figure out, okay, where is this repository of code that we want to take a look at? And that is just, frankly, that might be a whole separate company that's going and collecting all of that and putting it in one place. So as an example, we've built a ServiceNow app that we're going to be announcing, probably in a couple weeks, that takes a CMDB that they already have, that's usually just going to be an application inventory, gets us those applications, or we can go get them on our own, build those SBOMs, generate those SBOMs, and then feed them back in to the CMDB. So now you have the system of record for all of the things that you were already tracking, but at a significantly more detailed level of depth and all of that. So with Zero Lens, Turbine does a great job of identifying the components and then correlating those components from like a version or a CPE or a Perl for the known vulnerabilities that exist for those things. There's a whole lot of reasons why those vulnerabilities might be a big problem or might not be a problem at all. Context and processor architecture, operating system, just a number of reasons that some stuff you find might not be a problem. With Zero Lens, what we're doing is looking for unknown vulnerabilities in compiled code. And we're doing that by building CWE checks, common weakness enumeration checks, against that compiled code. Once again, doing CWE checks in source code, there's a million people doing that. That's a significantly easier problem. Doing it in compiled code is drastically more difficult and complex for a number of reasons. And kind of the bang for your buck is a lot more in the compiled code space. Because if you find something there, it's there. If you find something in source code, it might get ripped out, it might get replaced during the compilation process, it might have a protection that there's just a number of other things that can happen there, which either increase or reduce the probability of a bad thing happening. But when you're looking at the final built thing, you know for sure it's actually there and is an actual problem. So, Zero Lens, we've built a couple dozen CWE checks there already. We've been able to find all manner of interesting things from small vendors to big vendors across the board, as well as determine the reachability of those particular weaknesses as well. And then we're using LLMs in there for a number of different things around explaining the particular issue that we've identified, as well as what would be the path to remediation for that issue that's been identified. And that's a great problem for LLMs to solve. That's one of the issues, kind of back to your prior question. I feel like a lot of people are trying to fit a square peg into a round hole as it comes to LLM use cases, like, oh, we're using an LLM for everything. And it's like, okay, that's just because, if you only have a hammer, then everything's a nail, I guess. But you've seen a lot of people use LLMs for use cases that maybe aren't the best for that. So, but in this case, we've honed in on a few that are really positive.
Yeah, in our chat before the podcast, you mentioned that you think the federal government's even a little ahead of commercial enterprises in terms of identifying this problem. Why do you think that is? And is this both an education awareness problem as well as a technology problem? how do we educate folks? And
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so, you know, listen, I spent almost a decade of my life working in the federal government. We work with the government a lot at NetRise. It's just a fact that the government's just very rarely the leading innovator, especially as it relates to technology and, cybersecurity in this way. And the reason for that is they can typically only work with bigger companies, and typically bigger companies are just less innovative. Like I'm not spilling any state secrets here, right? Because getting to meet the compliance and regulations to be able to work with the government is a lot more onerous. So that's some of the reasons why they're just usually behind. But in this case, the primary efforts came from the government. So Alan Friedman, who's at CISA now, and began this initiative when he was at the NTIA, pushing for software bill of materials and creating a minimum elements for SBOMs. And then when he got to CISA, it was really more about operationalizing, like how do we do this? What are the best ways to do this? What are the right tools to do this? All of those things. You have the executive order 14028 that came out in May of 2021 about securing the nation's supply chain. You've had multiple binding operational directives that are adjacent to this problem. So as an example, finding vulnerabilities that are on the CISA KEV, the known exploited vulnerabilities list. How are you figuring out if you have vulnerabilities on the CISA KEV if you don't know what components you have? How can you possibly answer that question in a true and accurate way? You really can't. And then, I think you're seeing a lot of change in leadership in the government from people that are coming from the private sector. So I mean, you look at Katie Arrington, who was the CISO of DoD, and she's there's another person coming in. I don't think we know exactly what she's going to be doing next just yet, but putting forth like the DoD SWIFT initiative, the software fast track, where having visibility into all the third-party code that the DoD is going to be procuring is just something that, I'll be honest, I'm blown away that that's even being discussed in the way that it is. It's amazing. And I just think that the nation state activity has gotten so acute that people are finally waking up that it's important to understand what's going on in the things that we're buying. I mean, just think about how kind of crazy it is that the Department of Defense is buying software from all these vendors and cannot tell you what's in that software.
Yeah, especially they're going into weapon systems and mission critical components of.
Yeah, and the components is kind of the first level. Under that, you have provenance of those components. So say it's an open source component. Okay, who are the contributors to that open source project? Are some of those contributors associated with the CCP? Are some of those contributors associated with other malicious contributions? Are some of these contributors people that have been prosecuted for computer crimes? Like they can't answer any of those questions. And so I think that there's just been, they have access to more information than we do, obviously. And I think that it's very, very telling that when you see such senior leadership within the federal government be the people that are putting this forward, they probably know something that we don't. Now, for those of us that have worked in the government, myself, my co-founder, a number of other people at NetRise as an example, we understand what's happening behind the scenes, of course. It's not too difficult to put those pieces together to understand, like, clearly software supply chain attacks are just exploding right now. Because if you're successful once, you're successful a million times. Whereas if you send one phishing email to one company, you're successful once. But if you can compromise the supply chain, you have a number of entry points that you could potentially exploit. Like, I mean, the SolarWinds thing is, of course, the biggest and best example, but there's plenty of others as well.
So if I'm the CISO or CEO or even the head of an enterprise and I come to NetRise, I don't know where to get started. Do you have partners or NetRise advisory services that helps get a framework, get a plan, so methodically you can make this happen. It's not an overnight exercise. So
Yeah.
how do you help organizations get started and know where to start?
Yeah. So, it's really interesting. We've started in a number of different ways for a number of different companies. We have a financial services company who started off looking at their edge IoT infrastructure. That's where they wanted to start. And their mindset was, I at least have something for the things that are on the inside of my network. Is it as good as what you guys are doing? No, but I have no visibility out there. So I'm going to start. That's where I'm going to start in that company. We have other companies who have said we are going to look at all software that we are procuring moving forward, all of it. So every day I get up and we get an email that says these particular customers uploaded these particular things, and it's incredible because you'll see from some of these customers that they've uploaded 100 pieces of software from maybe 50 different vendors. And so you can tell that people are taking this serious and building these inventories. So that's another approach. And then say we're selling to the consumers. We might start with the product security team, only looking at the things that they're putting in front of their customers. And so from a implementation and continuous services or like a managed service offering, we do have partners both on the federal side and on the commercial side. NetRise has adopted a 100% channel first strategy. So we're always looking for service providers that have this expertise. I can't mention any in particular because the ink isn't dry yet, but there's some very big commercial VARs who have very large service portfolios that, as an example, are offering third-party risk assessments as services. And my pitch to them was basically, hey guys, you're walking into organizations and selling them a questionnaire, and you're helping them build some process and workflows around, you send your vendors this information, you get it back, but at the end of the day, you're really just kind of collecting data that you're not doing a ton of analysis on, because you have to buy the thing at the end of the day usually. With NetRise, that same offering can now have a productized version built in. So now the partners get, some managed services, ARR associated with that, or at least just continuous annual revenue. And the customers are getting this continuous visibility into whatever it is they're buying. And then over time, you can begin to say, okay, we're going to draw the line in the sand here. We're going to say we are no longer buying software that has end of life or end of support software components, or we're no longer buying software that has 3 critical vulnerabilities or more. That where to draw that line and where to create that gating mechanism is a moving target right now, and I think that'll become more fleshed out in the near term, and we're actively working on a number of initiatives in that area. But there's just a number of different ways that we can enter into a particular enterprise. What we're starting to see now is people are most interested in just saying, hey, just give me an unlimited license, because I don't know exactly where I'm going to find the most traction necessarily, but I want to have the flexibility to do that. And so we've done it a handful of different ways, but that seems to be the most common currently.
So I certainly learned a lot. I hope the audience did. And back to simplest terms, someone drops off a bag of groceries. First thing, you got to know what's in there. But more importantly, you don't know if it's spoiled. You don't know if there's red dye in it. That's, you do because it has the bill of materials. Yet you're using the software, firmware in your enterprise, and have no idea what's going on. So tools like NetRise, and NetRise in particular, with what you guys are doing, laser focused on this one problem. As Tom mentioned, really bright people. I get a chance to work with them, some of the smartest people to work with, and certainly could advise enterprises out there that are thinking of this. Also, I'd recommend, this really comes to life in a demo when you see it in action. So anybody's able to contact Carasoft. I think there'll be some information at the end on the screen. We'd be happy to set up a demo, either virtual or in person.
Yeah, and one comment on that, I would say, a really interesting thing around our, I guess, go-to-market motion is you can essentially get a POC from us in the first meeting, because I don't need to know anything about your environment to know that you're using Zoom, that you have these
right.
network devices, that you have this firewall, that you have this office suite, that you have these finance applications, right? Everyone's using the same stuff. So we can show you visibility into things that I can guarantee you have in your environment, and I can guarantee you I can show you visibility into those things in your environment that you've never had before.
Yeah, we did a POV for a large network, fiber optic network across the state, and they only gave us 3 devices to start with.
Yep.
And we found vulnerabilities in 2 of them.
Yep.
And that's where they know they needed NetRise. So I'd like to thank Tom again. Hopefully everybody will reach out. I'd like to thank Carasoft and appreciate everybody attending. And that concludes our discussion today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.